Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Today I have a story for you about a serial killer you have most likely never heard of. Here on Dark Hearts, we talk a lot about whether or not serial killers are born or made, and this killer falls, for many, into the born bad category. This man is a bad seed, but that's only half the story. There are many people who feel that the police handled this case terribly and even incompetently. There are even accusations of a cover-up. This serial killer also had accomplices, including his own wife, Michelle Martin, among others. As if that were not bad enough, this monster escaped during a prison transport, and what followed was the largest manhunt in Belgium's history. Belgian people were so angry about this case that 300,000 people gathered for a protest, and it turned violent. Today, we are talking about serial killer Marc Dutroux, the Beast of Belgium. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Marc Dutroux was born on November 6, 1956 in Lille, which is a suburb of Brussels. He was the eldest of 5 children in a family that was marked by dysfunction and instability. His parents were both teachers. They had a turbulent relationship, and their marriage eventually ended in divorce. As a result, Dutroux and his siblings moved frequently, living in various towns in Belgium. Now, we have to address the elephant in the room. I just said that this serial killer, to many, is someone who was born bad, but he also had a somewhat dysfunctional childhood. Here's where the split takes place for me. A lot of people have similar childhoods. A lot of people's parents get divorced. A lot of people's parents argue. Those people do not go on to do the things that Marc Dutroux did. And Marc was troubled from an early age. There are accounts of Dutroux's early years suggesting that he was a difficult and disturbed child. He reportedly displayed signs of defiance and antisocial behavior from a very young age. His parents, who were strict and sometimes apparently abusive, struggled to discipline him. This was a kid that was out of control. After the divorce, Marc Dutroux's mother gained custody of the children, but Marc Dutroux developed a rebellious streak that distanced him from his family, and he kind of became the family embarrassment. Now, we obviously cannot discount the accusations of abuse, as we know that abuse very often plays a role in people who become violent later in life. But Marc was known even in preschool and kindergarten as a kid who had issues and who caused trouble. When you've got a kid that young that is already displaying behavioral issues, you're kind of dealing with a different animal. By his teenage years, Marc Dutroux had become known for his manipulative and deceitful behavior. He often stole from his classmates, and he engaged in petty crimes. He also had an interest in violence and control. It has been reported that he engaged in cruel acts towards animals. We know that is a red flag. Despite Marc's troubled youth, Dutroux managed to get married early in his 20s to a woman named Michelle Martin. They had 3 children together, but their relationship was highly dysfunctional, filled with domestic abuse and criminal activity. We are going to talk more about Michelle Martin in a moment because there's a lot to unpack there. Long before becoming a notorious serial killer, Marc Dutroux had already established himself as a dangerous criminal in the area he lived in. In the 1980s, he was involved in a string of crimes, including theft, burglary, and violent offenses. However, his most heinous early crimes were those of sexual violence. Between 1985 and 1986, Dutroux was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting 5 teenage girls. These crimes followed a pattern. He would abduct young girls, hold them captive, and subject them to... It's hard to know what I can say here. I just had a video get demonetized last week that was one of the most benign stories I've covered in quite some time. It's frustrating. I always try to err on the side of caution and bleep things out and use different words. And that still doesn't seem to do it. I don't know. I think these crimes are important to talk about. And I think it's important that we remember the victims and how these crimes occurred. It's just history, you know? Marc Dutroux's victims were usually between the ages of 10 and 19, and he often used manipulation and violence to control them. Where was Marc keeping his captives? At his house. The house that he often shared with Michelle Martin. Apparently, she had her own place as well. How did he keep his captives a secret? Oh, he didn't. Michelle Martin was well aware that her husband, fiancé, boyfriend was kidnapping and holding young girls, and she did absolutely nothing about it. Maybe this is sexist of me, but a woman who hurts other women and children is worse than a man who does. Yeah, that's probably definitely sexist, but it's the truth for me. I don't know if you feel the same way. There's just something about a woman who commits these kinds of acts that I find more disturbing than when a man commits them. Yeah, it's sexist. Marc's actions finally caught up with him in 1986 when he was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison for and abduction. Many believed this would be the end of his criminal activities. However, in a controversial decision, Marc Dutroux was released after serving only 3 years. I've been covering a lot of foreign cases lately, and it never ceases to amaze me how small the sentences are. Apparently in Belgium, there was a policy of reducing sentences for good behavior. Releasing Marc Dutroux early would be something that would come back to bite the Belgian authorities in the ass hard. And rightfully so. 3 years for multiple assaults and kidnapping of children. 3 years. Upon his release in 1992, Marc Dutroux resumed his criminal activities almost immediately. He began working on his house in Marcinelle, which is a suburb of Charleroi. Marc modified the house. He remodeled it and he added something to it. A secret room hidden behind a wall that would serve as a dungeon. Now, Marc had an acquaintance named Michel Lelevray. Lot of Michels going on here. Michel Martin is spelled Michel Martin. Michel Lelevray is spelled Michel. I think that's like Michael. So we've got two different Michels. I know it's a little bit confusing. Michel Lelevray and Marc Dutroux purchased what else? A creepy windowless murder van, and they began trolling areas in Belgium looking for victims. On June 24th, 1995, two 8-year-old girls were playing outside one of the girls' homes near Liège. They were Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo. We do not know how, but both girls disappeared. Their parents went to the police and were met with astonishing reactions. The police were not concerned. Officers told the parents that the girls would come home soon and not to worry. The parents were in shock. They couldn't believe that the police were not concerned about two missing small children, 8 years old. After days of the parents making their own missing posters and rallying neighbors and volunteers, the police finally decided to act, and they launched an extensive search. However, the investigation was mismanaged and key leads were overlooked. We would even find out later on that a police officer went to Marc Dutroux's house, but because Dutroux had constructed a wall over the opening to his dungeon, the cop didn't find it. It gets worse. The cop heard the two little girls screaming while at Marc Dutroux's house, and Marc Dutroux convinced the cop that the screams were coming from children playing in the street. If you've got two missing kids and you're at some guy's house in the area where they disappeared and you hear screaming, there is nothing that could convince me not to tear that house apart. I know people have rights. I know sometimes cops overstep those rights. I get it. But you got two missing kids in the area. I can completely understand why this case ends up going in the direction that it did. We're getting there. Marc Dutroux had taken Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo and imprisoned them in his homemade dungeon. He kept these little girls captive for months, subjecting them to... During this time, he recorded their suffering on videotapes, which would later be used as crucial evidence against him. This guy is sick, doesn't cover it. Depraved, doesn't cover it. The worst of the worst. As if this were not bad enough, months later, in December of 1995, Marc Dutroux was briefly arrested for an unrelated car theft. While he was in jail, his wife, Michelle Martin, failed to feed the girls. Michelle would later say she was afraid to go into the dungeon. Bullshit. She wasn't afraid. The guy was in jail. She is just as cowardly and just as evil as Dutroux is. These little girls sat in this dungeon for weeks without food or water until they both starved to death. Dutroux got out of jail and found that the girls were dead, and he buried their bodies in the backyard of his house. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, while I was researching this case, I found my mind wandering to what those days must have been like for these little girls. And I had to stop myself from thinking about it because it is just too horrible to wrap my head around. It's one thing to read a news article or to talk about a story, but if you really stop and think about the days and days and days that someone sat there starving to death, a child, yeah, it's too much. And this devil, Michelle Martin, well, she made sure to feed the dogs, which is great, but not the girls. Then, on August 23rd, 1995, 17-year-old Anne Marchal and 19-year-old Eefje Lambrecks were kidnapped by Marc Dutroux. He was assisted by Michel Lelivre. These girls were taken to the dungeon where they endured horrific abuse. Marc would later go on to say that he really liked Eefje and enjoyed talking with her. She wanted to be a journalist and was studying to play the saxophone. I'm going to leave out the worst of the details, but it was bad. It was really bad. And Marc Dutroux took these girls and buried them alive. I had thoughts about how he did this. You know, they would be screaming, obviously. Maybe they were gagged. Maybe they were drugged, but he buried them alive. On May 28, 1996, 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne was abducted while riding her bike to school. Marc Dutroux and Michel Lelivre followed the girl in their creepy murder van as she rode along a village street. They pulled up next to Sabine and grabbed her. Marc Dutroux then threw her in the back of the van, and Michel Lelivre drove her to the house with the dungeon. Dutroux held Sabine captive in that underground dungeon, repeatedly assaulting and terrorizing her. He told Sabine that he had kidnapped her at the direction of someone else who wanted her parents to pay a ransom and that her parents would not pay. But he, being the kind person he was, decided not to kill Sabine. He told her that he was her savior. He brainwashed her into thinking he was taking care of her and that he had saved her life. Dutroux forced Sabine to write letters to her family, attempting to deceive them into believing she had run away. For 80 days, this continued, but in the midst of her captivity, Sabine was soon joined by another victim. On August 9th, 1996, 14-year-old Laetitia Delhez was abducted while walking home from a swimming pool. Just like with Sabine, Marc Dutroux and Michel Lelivre pulled up their van and grabbed the girl from the street in broad daylight. The fact that these abductions were not witnessed to me means one of two things. Either the kidnappers were extremely lucky or witnesses did not call the police. I would like to think it was the former because the thought of people witnessing these atrocities and not doing anything is too much. Unlike previous victims, Laetitia's disappearance was quickly noticed, and witnesses reported seeing a suspicious vehicle in the area. No one admitted to seeing the actual kidnapping, but people did come forward to describe a white van with two dark-haired men inside, and this lead would eventually be crucial in bringing Dutroux down. Police took the descriptions given by witnesses, and they traced Dutroux's van, a white Fiat, back to him. This is when police realized that an officer had previously gone to Dutroux's home but had failed to find anything, even with Julie and Melissa trapped in his dungeon. And on August 13th, 1996, authorities arrested Marc Dutroux, his wife, Michelle Martin, and his accomplice, Michel Lelivre. Police then conducted a more thorough search of Dutroux's house, and this is when they uncovered the horrifying reality. In the concealed dungeon beneath his house, authorities found Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez alive, but traumatized. These girls were still alive. Their rescue was a moment of national shock and relief. You can see the girls being rescued here, taken from their prison, out into the streets looking disoriented and shaken. The girls clung to each other and were met by their parents at the police station, where a very emotional reunion took place. This is so very rare in these types of cases, and it is nothing short of a miracle that these girls were found alive. I don't have to tell you, you are true crime aficionados. We know that people that are kidnapped are usually killed within the first 48 hours of disappearing. So to have these two girls found alive, I mean, it's rare. With Marc Dutroux, Michel Martin, and Michel Delhez now in custody, cops turned their attention to Dutroux's backyard, where they discovered the remains of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo. The bodies of Anne Marchal and Eefje Lambrecks were also discovered, and at autopsy, it was confirmed that they had been buried alive. The public was outraged, and when information leaked about the cop who'd been at the house when the two 8-year-olds were still alive, anger grew. Rumors began to spread about a larger network of files operating in the area. Names of politicians and wealthy businessmen circulated, and the public, by and large, became convinced that Marc Dutroux had been allowed to continue his behavior because he was being protected. The public began to believe that the higher-ups of Belgian society were involved in unthinkable acts, and soon chaos erupted. On a chilly fall day, not long after the discovery of a monster in their midst, the Belgian people took to the streets. Over 300,000 people swarmed the streets of Brussels, marching and protesting, demanding answers as to why this maniac had not been stopped. Serious mistrust and rage toward the police boiled over, and people drove for miles to become part of the protest that was called the White March. Everyone in attendance was either wearing something white or carrying a white balloon. Soon, the police lost control of the crowd. Some protesters threw water bottles and even firebombs. The police responded with tear gas and water hoses, spraying the crowd in an attempt to disperse it. The crowd stormed the steps of government buildings, and it seemed Belgium was on the brink of a revolution. The public was demanding reform in the police department and more transparency with regards to suspected pedophiles in positions of authority. There was proof of human trafficking and high-level corruption, and the people were convinced that Marc Dutroux was just the tip of the iceberg. Now, you know, I am not a big conspiracy theorist. I also think this was kind of the midst of satanic panic in Europe. It had passed at this point in time in America, but it was still alive in Europe at this point. So some of that phenomenon could have played into this. But the more I researched this, the more I came to believe there really was something very dark and disturbing going on in Belgium at that time. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. After the protests were over, a memorial was created for the victims of child abuse and trafficking, and the Prime Minister, Jean-Luc Dehaene, fell under heavy scrutiny. This fervor continued for weeks, and change was promised. Some say it wasn't enough. But then, as is so often the case, news stories arrive and people get distracted. In this case, the distraction was a prison escape. On April 23, 1998, Marc Dutroux was transported from Arlon Prison to a courthouse in Neufchâteau, which is a small town in southern Belgium. This was for a routine pretrial hearing. Given the public outrage surrounding his case and the widespread calls for reform, one would expect tight security measures. One would expect. However, a series of critical mistakes and oversights allowed this serial killer to break free. What happened next in Belgium further incensed the public. Despite being one of Belgium's most dangerous criminals, Dutroux was escorted by just 3 police officers, an astonishingly low level of security for a man who had orchestrated such horrific crimes. When he was brought to the courthouse, Dutroux was not restrained. Standard protocol for dangerous criminals dictates the use of handcuffs and shackles, yet Dutroux was allowed a shocking degree of freedom. I'm going to put my conspiracy hat on for just a moment. I wonder if only 3 police officers were sent to escort him and he was allowed to go unshackled because perhaps someone was supposed to take him out. I thought a lot about this while writing this story. If he was connected to a powerful ring of, and they knew he was going to be transported on this day, what if only 3 guards were assigned to him because somebody was supposed to get him so he wouldn't talk? And then perhaps something went wrong. I don't know. It was just a thought that kept coming to me while I was writing this story. Well, nobody does take him out. And being the dangerous predator that he is, Marc Dutroux saw his chance and he took it. One of the officers escorting Marc Dutroux, Inspector Jacques Devissier, was overpowered by the killer. Reports state that Dutroux managed to seize the officer's firearm, a loaded revolver, and he used it to threaten the other guards. How do you get a cop's gun away from him when there's 3 cops and you? You see what I'm saying? Something just smells off here. So now we have a serial killer and abuser with a loaded gun taken from a cop who was supposed to be getting him to court. With his newly acquired weapon, Dutroux forced the guards to comply, and he made his way outside the courthouse. He then stole a police car and drove away at high speed, vanishing into the Belgian countryside. This is Keystone Cops. This is a Saturday Night Live skit. The level of incompetence that would have to be present in these police officers and their supervisors to allow this just seems off to me. The whole country's watching. The whole country is incensed about this case. And then you're going to let this guy walk to court with 3 cops and no shackles or handcuffs? I don't know. I actually can't wait to hear what you guys have to say about it. And I recognize this was 30 years ago, but still, I smell bullshit. Word of the escape, as you can imagine, spread like wildfire. The Beast of Belgium, the monster who had taken children off the streets and caused bedlam in Brussels, was free. Dutroux's escape sent Belgium into an immediate state of emergency. The public, already enraged by his crimes, reacted with fury and disbelief at the justice system's incompetence. How could such a high-profile criminal escape so easily? How was it possible that he had overpowered police officers and drove away in a squad car? I would like to know as well. Within hours of Dutroux's escape, a nationwide manhunt was underway. Every available law enforcement agency was deployed to locate and capture this killer. The Belgian military was also placed on high alert, with soldiers dispatched to assist in the search. Airports, train stations, and border crossings were heavily monitored to prevent Dutroux from fleeing the country. The situation became even more tense as Belgian authorities realized that Dutroux had a network of criminal contacts who might assist him in disappearing. Many feared that he would kidnap more people, and that led to mass hysteria and widespread public protests. Belgians gathered in the streets demanding information. People armed themselves. It was total and complete chaos. The police, who were already mistrusted, had done something so stupid, or had they, that whatever little trust was left between the cops and the Belgian people went out the window. The panic level was rising by the hour. People picked their children up from school. They left their offices and workplaces and went home to lock their families inside their houses. The fear was that the Beast of Belgium would not be caught, and if he was, there might be additional murders before he could be captured. Marc Dutroux abandoned the stolen police car in Saint-Mard, a small village near the French border. He then attempted to continue his escape on foot. The killer obviously knew he would be caught if he continued driving the police car and felt his only possible escape would be running into the forest. A local forest ranger who had heard about the manhunt on the radio noticed a dark-haired man walking through a wooded area. Realizing that this could be the fugitive, he immediately alerted the police. At this point, not gonna lie, I might have just rounded up a few good old boys. Because the police, their track record on this thing is leaving a lot to be desired. But Belgian police, acting on the tip, showed up in force and surrounded the area. After a brief search, Marc Dutroux was located for a second time, and he was arrested and taken into custody. While his escape was short-lived, the damage had already been done. Belgium had suffered yet another humiliating failure in its handling of one of its most infamous criminals. This time, someone's head had to be on the chopping block. The public was demanding it, and even the leaders in the police department knew they had to show the Belgian people that they could be trusted. Dutroux's escape triggered an unprecedented political scandal in Belgium. Public confidence was at an all-time low. It was collapsed. Interior Minister Louis Taubec resigned in disgrace, accepting responsibility for the failures. Justice Minister Stéphane de Klerk also stepped down, facing overwhelming criticism. Several high-ranking police officials and prison administrators were fired or forced to resign. This escape was the final straw, and the Belgian police force was in shambles. The families of Dutroux's victims were devastated. They had fought for years to expose systemic failures in the Belgian justice system, and for them, this escape proved that really nothing had changed. The parents of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo publicly condemned the government, stating that Belgium had failed their children once again. In the aftermath of the scandal, major reforms were introduced in Belgium's prison security and judicial procedures. High-risk criminals were placed under tighter surveillance. Well, okay, good to know. Good to know that it took the escape of a serial killer to get the cops to do more than walk a man around without shackles or handcuffs. Stronger escort protocols were introduced, requiring multiple armed guards for dangerous inmates. Prison staff underwent stricter training to prevent future incidents. Despite these reforms, the scars of the Dutroux affair remained, leaving a lasting stain on Belgium's justice system. Marc Dutroux's escape from custody remains one of the most embarrassing and tragic failures in Belgian law enforcement history. Though his freedom lasted only 3 hours, it symbolized the ongoing incompetence and negligence that had allowed Dutroux to operate for years before his arrest. This really triggered a complete overhaul of the justice system in Belgium. I'm just thinking about everything that's going on right now. You know, sometimes it does take a marked event to create change. The problem is those marked events usually involve the loss of life. And I hate to think what might be coming. Though Marc Dutroux would never again taste freedom, the damage caused by his crimes and the failures surrounding them will never be forgotten. Even today, his name remains a symbol of systemic failure, and this escape serves as a very chilling reminder of what can happen when justice fails to protect the innocent. It was a dark time in Belgium, and the public was anxious for the killer's trial to begin. They would have to wait for years. Marc Dutroux's trial begins in 2004, nearly 8 years after his arrest. The case was one of the most followed in Belgian history, drawing massive media attention. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including videotapes of the abuse, testimony from the surviving victims, and forensic evidence linking Dutroux to the murders. Marc Dutroux attempted to portray himself as a scapegoat, claiming he was merely a pawn in a larger network of criminals. His claims were dismissed as manipulative lies by the prosecutors, but the public wasn't so sure. And like I said earlier, there is some very real proof, including testimony from women who are now adults, that there was, in fact, a network of powerful files operating in Belgium, and some of them were in very high positions of authority. Attempts have been made to discredit some of the women giving this testimony, and that, to me, only makes their accusations more believable. Nobody would want to involve themselves in something like this unnecessarily. A law enforcement officer named Jean-Marc Conneret, who helped rescue Sabine and Laetitia, he took the stand on August 15th. He cried as he remembered the death threats sent to him when he led the investigation of Marc Dutroux. Conneret was accused of having ties to organized crime and said that the entire event changed him forever. This cop was actually taken off the case because he attended a charity dinner in honor of the victims. The heads of the police department were mad that he went to a charity dinner for the victims. This really turned the Belgian public against the police department, and they began to see Jean-Marc Conneret as the singular good guy in the whole situation. The trial was emotional and at times heated. The rescued girls attended, and the press praised their bravery, the courage that it took to face their abductor, their rapist and this killer. On June 22, 2004, 47-year-old Marc Dutroux was found guilty on multiple charges, including murder, abduction, and torture. He was sentenced to life in prison. He is in prison to this day. Michelle Martin, his wife, received 30 years for her role in the crimes, but was controversially released on parole in 2012 after serving only 16 years. 16 years for assisting in 4 murders, for allowing 2 little girls to starve to death just feet away from her. Nope, I don't get it. I don't understand some of these sentences that we see in foreign cases. This woman is free. She has been for a long time, and I simply don't get it. Michel Lelivre was convicted of complicity in the kidnappings along with other charges. There was a 4th defendant, a man named Michel Nihoal, another Michel, who was convicted for being part of a gang that smuggled drugs and people into Belgium. So yes, there is some very real evidence of a conspiracy, of a network here. The Dutroux case had a profound impact on Belgium. Public outrage led to mass protests, including the White March, with the 300,000 people demanding reform. The case exposed massive failures in the Belgian justice system, leading to major police reforms and stricter measures for handling child abduction cases. Marc Dutroux came up for parole in 2019, and thankfully his request for parole was denied. He was claiming he was no longer a threat. Thank you, baby Jesus. They did not let him go. A psychiatrist report concluded that Marc Dutroux is still dangerous. Also, the sky is blue and water is wet. In 2023, a memorial garden was erected and opened on the site of Marc Dutroux's former home. Authorities tore down the House of Horrors that once stood in Charleroi, so it would not serve as an attraction for those interested in the case. Julie's father, Jean-Denis Lejeune, spoke. He said, "Thank you for preserving the memory of our little ones with this superb work. It is important to remember that pedophilia existed and that it still exists." The survivors, Sabine and Laetitia, reunited at the site and embraced. The women have gone on to speak publicly about their ordeal. Marc Dutroux's crimes remain one of the darkest chapters in Belgium's history. His case exposed deep flaws in law enforcement, led to national reform, and left lasting scars on the country. The pain and suffering he inflicted on his victims and their families will never be forgotten, but his capture and conviction ensured that he could never harm another child again. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Would you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me? It helps a lot. You know, I'm kind of on a ticking clock here, and we got to see a lot of movement. Thank you, especially to my patrons. I've got my podcast, Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. It's on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. I post brand new episodes every Monday and Wednesday. You know, we've still got our fundraiser going. Watch this short video on our channel if you would like to donate a few dollars to possibly help us solve some cold crimes. I hope you're well, my friends. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this story and the kind of mini conspiracy that lives within it. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.